Hey Twisters, so for today's video, I'm going to be talking about the best NHL rebuilds since the salary cap era. So we've seen a lot of teams out there draft and develop amazing teams, some of them almost even dynasty worthy. And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit here today. I decided to make this video because there are some teams right now going through lengthy rebuilds, and we're finally maybe seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for those teams. We're talking about like the Buffalo Sabres, the Ottawa Senators, Detroit Red Wings, so on and so forth. So anyway, I wanted to look back at teams that have already won the Stanley Cup or have come out of the rebuilds and been very competitive. We've got a total of 9 rebuilds. Anyway, if you enjoy this video and want me to produce a follow-up on current teams coming out of their rebuilds right now, just leave a like on this video, and if we get over 100 likes, I will produce that content. This is going to be more of a podcast style video. Otherwise, it would have taken 30 or 40 hours to produce, and I just don't have that time, unfortunately. But I'm sure that you're going to find this very fascinating because the way that each team has rebuilt has been quite unique, or at least for most of these. Anyway, we're going to get into this. We're going to do this chronologically because we're all about that chronic here. We're going to start with actually just before the salary cap era and early on into the mid-2000s. And the first team, actually really the first 2 teams we want to talk about here, the Pittsburgh Penguins and also the Washington Capitals, because they are kind of similar stories in how they drafted their franchise cornerstones, and in a matter of just a couple of years, they were able to take off in the salary cap era. So we'll start with this team here, the Penguins, and thanks again, CJ. Craig Patrick is actually the general manager of the Penguins at this time. Craig Patrick from the 1980 Winter Olympics team as one of the coaches there. And here the Penguins, of course, had come off of a great period in the 1990s, the Lemieux era certainly, and Jaromir Jagr. And then things kind of fall apart, but they're able to bounce back, I think, pretty quickly. And as a couple of you have pointed out, they were actually in danger of losing their franchise a couple of times too. Starting in 2003, first overall pick in what is an absolutely stacked draft, they draft Marc-Andre Fleury, and of course he's part of 3 Stanley Cups there. Another trade that happens around that time is when they trade Johan Hedberg to the Canucks, and they get Alex Goligoski in the draft there. The next year, second overall, so they have a bad season despite having Fleury, but of course he's not playing for them at that time. And they get Evgeny Malkin at second overall. They also get Tyler Kennedy at 99th overall. I know he was part of that Cup-winning team. And then the next year after that, right, there's Sidney Crosby first overall. So they have 3 of the top 2 picks in 3 consecutive years. That's something that we probably won't see as often these days, especially with the draft lottery and that sort of thing. But also, we can't forget that in 2005, in the 3rd round early on, there's Chris Letang. And that's another potential Hall of Fame player there for Pittsburgh. Now, Ray Shero takes over in 2006. And this is where they are able to quickly get competitive. I do want to touch on this a little bit. I won't be getting into this too much for each of these teams. It's more about when they actually suck, what do they do? Eventually, they trade for very little away for Marian Hossa and Pascal Dupuis. And in 2009, they trade Ryan Whitney to the Ducks for Chris Kunitz. That works out pretty well for both parties, especially for the Penguins. We don't forget 2017 in overtime, Game 7 of the conference final. And also in 2012, they get another franchise cornerstone there in Brian Dumoulin in a trade with the Carolina Hurricanes for Jordan Staal. So again, another trade that works out for both parties. And as a result of this, the Penguins from 2007 all the way up until this past season, I don't think they missed the playoffs a single year. And of course, they've got 3 Stanley Cups. They went to another final very early on in Sidney Crosby's time there. Who knows, if Crosby and Malkin didn't have those injury problems, especially Crosby, then they might even have more hardware to their trophy case. Another team that is very similar in how they built themselves, especially around that time, were the Washington Capitals. Again, they were a team that was pretty competitive in the 90s. They got to a Stanley Cup final, and with George McPhee early in the 2000s, they're able to take off very quickly and rebound very well. So, of course, the big pick comes first, right? In 2004, it's Alex Ovechkin first overall. Malkin second. 4th overall is Nicholas Backstrom in 2006, along with Semyon Varlamov. Now, Varlamov didn't win a Stanley Cup with the Capitals, but he was a great goaltender for them for a number of years, as they, like the Penguins, were pretty much in the playoffs every single season. Then in 2008, again, this team is already in the playoffs, but they do add on quite a bit in terms of franchise cornerstones through drafting and development. 27th overall in 2008, there's John Carlson, who's been a Norris finalist before. Braden Holtby, their Stanley Cup winning goaltender, at 93rd. The next year, Dmitry Orlov at 55th overall. Yevgeny Kuznetsov the following year, 2010, in 26th. Philip Grubauer, 112th overall. And we had in 2012 a couple of great picks despite what was a weak draft class in the likes of Tom Wilson, 16th overall, Chandler Stevenson at 77th overall, and Andrei Burakovsky in 2013 was drafted 23rd overall. So they were able to really set the franchise up well while they were still pretty competitive, but those players were certainly instrumental in them actually getting over the hump, getting to a Stanley Cup final, and winning their first Stanley Cup. Now we go to the Chicago Blackhawks, and this is one that really does stand out to me because it's the exact reverse. They actually had their Stanley Cup winning team, and Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane were the final pieces of that. I didn't think that something like that would play out. Let's take a look at this comment here from IceWire. So Kane in 07, and then they make the conference final 2 years later, and they win the Stanley Cup the year after that. That's a very quick turnaround when you bring in a franchise cornerstone like that. The closest thing to a Stanley Cup or salary cap era dynasty in 2015. I gotta call it a dynasty. I know it's not officially a dynasty by the NHL's terms or the Hockey Hall of Fame, but when you win 3 in 6 seasons with the salary cap, absolutely, I think that qualifies. So their general manager early in the 2000s who gets things rolling along is Mike Smith. I don't really know anything about him. I know that there's a football coach named Mike Smith and of course the goaltender, but this is a different Mike Smith. So in 02, in the second round at 54th overall, they get a guy who ends up winning 2 Norris trophies. That is Duncan Keith. They draft James Wisniewski, who had a good career, at 156th. And they get Adam Burish for some toughness, and he's part of one of their cup-winning teams at 282nd. The next year, another cornerstone on defense, Brent Seabrook, who had over 1,000 games played in the NHL, at 14th overall. This is a great draft class. They get Corey Crawford, maybe a Hall of Fame-worthy goaltender, at 52nd. I think he won a Conn Smythe for them. And man, at 245th overall, there's Dustin Byfuglien. And man, imagine if he would have stayed on that team. Who knows? Maybe they could have won more than 3 Stanley Cups. Big Buff had himself a great career. The next general manager is Bob Pulfer. And in 04, he drafts a couple other players who are part of the Stanley Cup winning rosters. Dave Bolland, 32nd overall. Brian Bickle at 41st overall. And Troy Brouwer, he was a very good player, I thought, until he signed that big contract. And he was selected much later in the draft. Dale Talon, former GM for the Florida Panthers, comes in 2005. Now, in 2004, they had traded away Alexander Karpovtsev, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, for a 4th-round draft pick. That becomes Nicholas Hjalmarsson, one of the best shutdown defensemen of that era, a very heavy hitter out there. And also, during the 05-06 season, they make a trade with the Flyers. They send to Philadelphia Matt Ellison. I don't even know this guy. This is as I'm just getting into the NHL, like as a hardcore fan. In exchange, they get Patrick Sharp. So, of course, when we talk about the great Blackhawks scorers, it starts with Kane, Toews, and Hossa. The next in line there, at least among the forwards, would have to be Patrick Sharp. Then we get to 06 and also 07. This is when the Hawks make a huge splash at the draft. So 3rd overall in 06 is Jonathan Toews, the captain for all 3 Stanley Cups and what will be a Hall of Fame career, certainly. They also had traded that season in 06-07. They traded away Brandon Bochenski, and in exchange they got Chris Versteeg, who was certainly instrumental in their first Stanley Cup in that era. The next year, of course, Patrick Kane, 1st overall in 07. They also traded away that season Jim Vandermeer, and they got Ben Eager, who, again, added some toughness for them in that first Stanley Cup run. 08, things really do start to snowball. They hire Joel Quenneville as their coach, and he wins all 3 Stanley Cups with them. They also traded away Tuomo Ruutu, and in exchange, they got Andrew Ladd. And then Stan Bowman is the general manager in 09. They add on even more. But at that point, man, the Hawks already had their Stanley Cup winning rosters. That was pretty set, I would have to say. Now, our 4th rebuild is the Los Angeles Kings from about 03 to 09. This is a team that was able to draft their franchise cornerstones, largely, and they added a lot of heft and a lot of toughness and size in the draft as well. So that tactic, that strategy, was something that they had certainly employed for a few years before they even were a competitive team making the playoffs. So it starts in 03, and at the time, their general manager, I believe, is Dave Taylor from the Triple Crown line. So in 03, 13th overall, the captain for their 2 Stanley Cups, that's Dustin Brown, and he plays many, many years in the NHL, and even the Kings unveiled a statue of him last season. 2 years after that, a couple more cornerstones, 11th overall is Anze Kopitar, and he's still performing at a very high level 18 years later. And at 72nd overall is Jonathan Quick, and Prime Quick was a spectacle. He was easily a top 3 goaltender in the NHL for a number of years, I would say. Now, in replacement of Dave Taylor in 06 comes Dean Lombardi, and he gets things started by trading away Pavel Dmitry, rest in peace, of course, for a first-round pick, and that becomes Trevor Lewis. And so that's where you start to see them adding a lot of depth and size and that sort of thing for what will be a Stanley Cup winning roster. They also trade for Jack Johnson, who didn't win a Stanley Cup for them, but he helps with them be a perennial competitive team at the start of the 2010s. The next year, Lombardi trades away Brent Sopel. He gets a 2nd rounder and a 4th rounder. That 2nd rounder at 61st overall becomes Wayne Simmons. Then he makes a trade with the Washington Capitals. The Capitals get Braden Holtby, but as a result of this, the Kings get Alec Martinez, one of the better shutdown defensemen of the era, led the NHL on blocks for a number of seasons. He's drafted at 95th overall, 109th overall. Again, more size, more of an enforcer by today's standards. That's Dwight King. 08, the next year, 2nd overall, Drew Doughty, Hall of Fame bound, Norris Trophy winner. They also trade away Lubomir Wisnowski for Matt Green and Jarrett Stoll, who wins 2 cups with them. And they also trade away a 2nd round pick for Brad Richardson. Maybe not the best value, but Richardson is part of one of those Stanley Cups. In 09, they actually drafted Braden Shen 5th overall. And they also got Kyle Clifford at 35th. So you see the trend here with adding more size and tenacity and that sort of thing. They also execute a 3-way trade. They give up a 2nd round pick, and that becomes Brian Dumoulin. But in exchange from Carolina, they get Justin Williams, Mr. Game 7. What a career he's had for a few different teams out there, but especially with the Kings for obvious reasons. So by the next season, they enter their competitive phase, and they're able to be one of the better teams in the Western Conference for about 6 or 7 years there. And later on, they'll draft Derek Forbort and Tyler Toffoli in 2010. They also get Tanner Pearson in the draft in 2012. And so those are a couple other players who win Stanley Cups with them. Actually, Forbort didn't, I don't think. And then, of course, right now, Rob Blake is their general manager, and he's done a good job of kind of almost a competitive rebuild in that the Kings, the roster had kind of gone stale. They needed to change things up and adapt to today's current NHL, and Rob Blake has really done a good job of bringing in a lot of young talent through the draft with players like Quentin Byfield, and we'll see what happens with Brandt Clark. And at the same time, they've attracted some other great players out there, whether that's through trades or free agency. So we're just talking about a few years removed from, kind of hitting rock bottom with that group of players from the 2010. And who knows, they could actually be a sexy pick to get to the Stanley Cup final this next season. Our next team is the St. Louis Blues, and I consider their rebuild to be about from 20 or I say 2005 because, you say 1905, right? So I say from 05 to 2011, the Blues. So they had like a 24-year streak of making the playoffs, coming to an end around the time of the lockout and, getting into the salary cap era. Larry Plow is the general manager, at least I think that's how it's pronounced. Now, they have a great draft in 05, even though these players don't have anything to do with the actual team as they're competitive and making the playoffs several years down the road. But they get TJ Oshie, my favorite player in the NHL. Ben Bishop, if it weren't for injuries, he would be a Hall of Fame goaltender. And they also get Ryan Reeves. The next year, they have the first overall draft pick, and they get Eric Johnson. Maybe not a traditional number 1 overall pick, but Johnson has had a very good career. And they also get Patrick Berglund at 25th, who does play a role in their more competitive years, or at least as they start building that up. In 07, man, this one stings me as a Sharks fan. Bill Guerin gets sent from St. Louis to the Sharks. The Sharks, Stanley Cup competing team, you would think. In exchange, the Sharks send their first round pick to the Blues. That becomes David Perron. Also in that draft, the Blues got Lars Eller at 13th and Ian Cole at 18th. 08, the next year, is a big one for them. 4th overall, they get Alex Pietrangelo, and especially after winning this Stanley Cup with the Golden Knights, and as that long-term captain for the Blues, he's got to be a Hall of Fame defenseman. And also Jake Allen, who is a crucial piece in this team being competitive year after year. He is selected at 34th overall. Later in that season, they also trade away Lee Stempniak to the Maple Leafs, and in exchange, they get Alexander Steen, and he plays over 1,000 games in the NHL and is part of that core going forward. Then we skip a year, we go to 2010, 14th overall, they draft Jaden Schwartz. They also had made a trade with the Ottawa Senators, sending away David Rundblad, but the Senators give the Blues their first-round pick at 16th overall, and that's used on Vlad Tarasenko. The next year, 46th overall, there's Joel Edmondson, and they also later that year trade away Eric Brewer to the Tampa Bay Lightning, and in exchange, they get a pick that they can use at 88th overall, and that is Jordan Binnington. The next year, the Blues are making the playoffs. It would take a number of years until they reach the conference final. Then they need a couple of years after that. They bring in Ryan O'Reilly, that sort of thing. And they only missed the playoffs once between 2012 and 2022. And the Blues, of course, putting an end to many decades of just coming up a little bit short there, winning a Stanley Cup after 52 years as a franchise. All right, this one's going to be a real fun one. Tampa Bay Lightning. So I consider their rebuild period from 2008 to 2014. This is a team that found so much value further down in the draft. I think that's the big theme here. Now, this team had already won a Stanley Cup in 2004. Things kind of did fall apart after that. They did get Alex Killorn in 2007, but I think things really ramp up in 2008. Number one pick, right? Steven Stamkos, face of the franchise for a long time, future Hall of Famer, two-time winning Stanley Cup champion as a captain. That was with Jay Feaster as the GM, and then in comes Brian Lawton. In 2009, they get another huge cornerstone early in the draft. Second overall, it's Victor Hedman, Norris Trophy winner, finalist a couple of times, future first ballot Hall of Famer, all that good stuff. Next in line at general manager in 2010, it's Steve Yzerman. It takes a year, but he makes a huge couple of splashes in 2011. Now, their first pick from that draft is Vladislav Nemesnikov, and certainly he has a role in helping the Lightning get competitive and get out of that hole, but it's really what happens after that. 58th overall is Nikita Kucherov, and this is crazy. 208th overall is Andre Palat. Now, in 2012, they somehow had made it to the conference final. They still had some good older veterans on that team. At the draft, though, they whiff on Slater Koekkoek at 10th overall, but at 19th, there's Andrei Vasilevsky, maybe the greatest postseason goaltender we've seen since Patrick Waugh. And let's not also forget that Cedric Paquette is selected 101st. He does have a role in them being a competitive club and winning a Stanley Cup. Then the next year rolls around. First of all, they hired John Cooper as their head coach, and he's, I think, the longest tenured head coach in the NHL for a reason. They select Jonathan Drouin 3rd overall, but we'll come back to him in just a second. 2014, after they made the playoffs, they start their competitive run. Somehow they ended up drafting 19th overall Tony DeAngelo. All the way down in 79th, though, is Braden Point. And even though they're a competitive team by now, I did want to touch on a few other things here. So after making the Stanley Cup final in 2015, they get Anthony Cirelli at 72nd, one of the best defensive players in the NHL. And they also find Ross Colton at 118th. All he ever did for them was score a Stanley Cup winning goal. 2017, that's where they trade away Jonathan Drouin for Mikhail Sergachev. 2018, trading away Vladislav Nemesnikov for JT Miller, who doesn't really add too much value for them long term, but they also get Ryan McDonough out of that. And at the end of it, the Bolts have 2 Stanley Cups. They went to a couple of finals there in that Yzerman and Brisebois era. And we're talking about 5, maybe 6 Hall of Famers on this team with Stamkos, Hedman, Kucherov, Vasilevsky, Braden Point. And if Sergachev can continue building on what was a stellar year from him this past season, then he could be part of that as well. John Cooper could be in the Hall of Fame as a coach as well. And I don't think the Tampa Bay Lightning are quite done just yet. Let's see what a full offseason does for them. Now we get to the last of our rebuilding teams who won a Stanley Cup, and this is the Colorado Avalanche. I consider their rebuild to largely be from 2011 to 17. This is where we've seen a lot of their good players actually be traded away, but the moves ended up paying off for them in the long term. So NHL Armchair GM says the Hawks 3-6 is impressive, but the Avalanche run was incredible. They looked unstoppable last year, and that's certainly true. We'll see, again, what a full offseason of rest does for them. Hopefully there's a chance that Landeskog can get back onto the ice. I know it's not going to happen this upcoming season, but this is a team that still has a lot of great players in their prime or not even entering their prime just yet. But let's rewind all the way back here. Greg Sherman was the general manager. And in 2009, they drafted Matt Duchene, 3rd overall. We'll talk about him a little bit later. That's why I wanted to stretch back to 2009. And 33rd overall. They also got Ryan O'Reilly, which is nuts. So we'll touch on those guys briefly later on. 2011, 2nd overall, there's Gabriel Landeskog. Franchise face, captain of the team. I think he was the youngest captain in the NHL at that time. They also traded away Kevin Shattenkirk, but they got Eric Johnson. And again, a great career for him so far as more of a stay-at-home defenseman. The next year or 2 years later, 1st overall, they get Nathan MacKinnon, right? Nathan MacKinnon, one of the elite forwards out there. And then in comes Joe Sakic. 2015, they get another huge franchise cornerstone at 10th overall, and that's Mikko Rantanen. And they also trade away Ryan O'Reilly in a deal that gets them JT Compher. And I know that Compher hasn't had the same career as O'Reilly, but still, he's had a huge role with the Avalanche for a number of years. And as a result of that, Compher got a fat deal in the offseason with the Red Wings. Now, in 2016, Jared Bednar is hired as their head coach. The first year is horrible because the roster is very depleted, but things only get better from there, and it ramps up pretty darn quickly. Then we get to 2017, again, a long period where the Avalanche aren't competitive or making the playoffs, and at 4th overall, it's a gift. They get Cale Makar, and I mean, this guy hasn't even entered his prime just yet, and he's probably the best defenseman in the NHL, and certainly the most exciting defenseman I've seen, I think, in my time. Later that year in the 2017-18 season, they trade away Matt Duchene. In exchange, they get Sam Girard, and also they get a 1st rounder, and that becomes Bowen Byram. So at that point, the Avalanche are building an absolutely stacked blue line, and they enter their competitive phase a couple of years later in 2019. And from here on out, they're making a bunch of great trades to support that group. Just the value they got in exchange for dealing away certain players and picks, getting players like Andrei Burakovsky, Nazem Kadri, Devon Taves. I still think that's one of the best trades we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. Darcy Kemper, their Stanley Cup winning goaltender, Josh Manson, Nico Sturm, Arturi Lehkonen, and so on. I mean, these were great trades. Like, every single one of them was a banger for the Avalanche. And even though they've lost some of those players since then, they still have just outstanding franchise cornerstones who could help this club be competitive for a number of years. And you got to credit Sakic and McFarland for how they've managed the salary cap. Of course, they won the Stanley Cup in 2022, and they did so in quite dominant fashion. Can they get back there in 2024? It's going to be hard without Landeskog, but I still think they're going to be one of the key contenders from that conference from the West. And who knows? That could last for a couple more years as well. And as for our last 2 teams, these are teams that rebuilt earlier in the 2010s and have come out of the rebuild, have made the playoffs, and are already Stanley Cup contenders. So I've got 2 more here. We'll also highlight a couple of honorable mentions. So I'm going to get started with the Carolina Hurricanes. This is a team that went a decade without making the playoffs, from 2009 to 2019. I'll say that their rebuild started really in 2012. So first of all, Jim Rutherford is the general manager. He serves that role a long time over there, so he won a Stanley Cup as GM. Now, he did have a couple of good picks in the likes of Jeff Skinner and Justin Falk. And he also got Freddie Anderson in 2010, although he went through a couple of teams before coming back to Carolina. But we start with 2012. They get Jordan Martinook at 58th overall, still on the roster over a decade later. And then at 120th, there's Jacob Slavin, one of the best values in recent years. They had traded away Brian Dumoulin to the Penguins, but they got Jordan Stahl in return, so it worked out for both parties. 2013. Now, the Hurricanes are interesting because they could even have won a Stanley Cup already. They could have won multiple Stanley Cups. They could have been better than what we see right now because they drafted, for example, in 2013, Elias Lindholm at 5th overall. They also got Brett Pesce at 66th. 2014, Ron Francis comes in as general manager. And as I was saying earlier with Lindholm, in 2015, in a great draft class, he gets Noah Hanifin 5th overall. And then at 35th, there is Sebastian Aho. And the Hurricanes are more of a by-committee team, but really Aho, to me, is still the face of the franchise. The next year in 2016, that was my dog sneezing. The next year in 2016, they trade for Teuvo Teravainen, Stanley Cup winner with the Blackhawks, for a 2nd rounder and a 3rd rounder, and Teravainen becomes instrumental in Aho's development. In 2017, 12th overall, the Canes select Martin Necas. Before the 2018 draft, Don Waddell replaces Ron Francis. He drafts second overall Andrei Svechnikov and Jack Drury at 42nd. We haven't seen enough of Drury just yet. My dog just sneezed again. But he is supposed to be part of that core going forward. And also in 2018, they dealt away Lindholm and Hanifin to the Calgary Flames. They were packaged together for Dougie Hamilton, who plays a few years in Carolina. Pans out pretty well, but they decide not to sign him, so he goes on to the Devils. But they also got the signing rights to Adam Fox. That's pretty mind-blowing to me. A team that could have had at one point Dougie Hamilton and Adam Fox, or if you just have Adam Fox right now in addition to some of their stellar defensemen already, that would have just like broken my TV with just how much amazing defensive talent there was. Anyway, the Hurricanes in 2018, that year, you can't forget this, they hire Rod Brind'Amour, and ever since then, with that core, all those players drafted, many of which are still around here, they've made the playoffs the past 5 years. They won the last 3 straight Metro Division titles. And I know they don't have a Stanley Cup, but not many teams have won 6 playoff series in those 5 years. I really think that they're a snake-bit franchise. They could use a little bit more help in 1 or 2 areas, but really from top to bottom, they are a strong franchise that's built around a real team ethic out there. And I think that they still have probably about 3 really good years with this group. All right, now we're going to go to our last team in just a second, but I do want to mention a couple of other teams here. The New York Rangers, I literally did produce a list of talking points for them, but the thing is that they already had some franchise cornerstones in place before that rebuild really kicked in 2018. Like Igor Shesterkin had been drafted a few years before then. They already had Chris Kreider and Mika Zibanejad. But the thing is that they really did rebuild their blue line exceptionally well during those few years from 2018 to 2021. So I got to give them some love there. Also, the Dallas Stars, with the way that they've drafted, with the likes of Miro Heiskanen, Jason Robertson, Jake Ottinger, Rope Hintz, among others. And I think that we've only seen the floor of what that group can do when led by that younger talent out there. So those were a couple teams. I even thought about the Maple Leafs a bit, the Panthers, even the Islanders had a few good years there. But ultimately, I had them off the list because I think there's kind of a gap between them and some of these other teams that we're talking about. So the last team I want to talk about, and this is one that a lot of you were probably anticipating, and that's the New Jersey Devils. And it was a long time waiting for this group. They had made the Stanley Cup final back in 2012, of course, toward the end of the Martin Brodeur era. And man, they were just awful for nearly a decade, except for like one season. But it's really proven that their suckiness is going to pay off, or at least you would think so, especially after what we saw this past season. Now with the Devils, this really kicks in, I would say, around 2017, but we'll backtrack a little bit here. So we're going to start with Lou Lamoriello as their general manager. Of course, he won 3 Stanley Cups with them. So in 2012, they got Damon Severson, who was on the team up until this offseason. They also got Alex Kerfoot, Miles Wood in 2013. Pavel Zacha is a strong forward for them for a few years. Mackenzie Blackwood in 2015 has a very promising start to his career. 2015, in comes Ray Shero. They get Nathan Bastian and Michael McLeod, who are still on the roster, sort of bottom 6 players there. And then they hit their first home run in 2016, 162nd overall. There's Jesper Bratt. He's just blossomed into a electric player in the Eastern Conference. Then, with this team still struggling to be competitive, first overall in 2017, there's Nico Hischier, Selke Trophy finalist this past season. Jesper Boqvist and Fabian Zetterlund are also part of this draft. We'll talk about Zetterlund a little bit later. And they do have that crazy season in 2017-18, which was pretty much on the back of Taylor Hall, an outstanding season in which he won the Hart Trophy. But after that, there's more rebuilding. So in 2018, they whiff on Ty Smith. I wish that would have panned out. Spokane Chiefs represent. But in the 5th round, they get Akira Schmid, and they also get Yegor Sharangovich. Again, he was on the roster until this offseason, and he's traded away for Tyler Toffoli. So he does bring them plenty of value. And with Schmid, great rookie season for him. We'll see if he can build on that and be that number 1 goaltender in the NHL. The next year, of course, with this team still down in the depths. First overall, Jack Hughes finishes 8th for the Hart Trophy this past year. I thought he could have maybe even finished higher. And in the 2nd round, they get Nikita, I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Ohotiuk. We'll talk about him in just a second as well. Then we get to 2020, and in comes Tom Fitzgerald. This guy is already becoming a legend among NHL executives. And they have a massive draft because they have 3 first-round picks. 7th overall is Alexander Holtz. We've only seen him a little bit so far, but there's so much upside, so much to look forward to. 18th overall, they get Dawson Mercer, who just came off a 27-goal season. And at 20th overall, they get Shakir Muhammadulin, a defenseman, and we'll touch on him shortly as well. The next year, this team still hasn't been competitive just yet. They get Luke Hughes early in the draft, and they also signed Dougie Hamilton. So they're like, okay, maybe we can actually start putting our cap to use here. 2022, 2nd overall, they draft Simon Nemec. We haven't seen him in the NHL just yet, but the defensive depth with this club is ridiculous. They also get Seamus Casey, and they sign Andre Palat. So it looks like the Devils are going to start to make some key moves out there so that they can get themselves out of the cellar of that division. That offseason, they also made a key trade, dealing away Ty Smith and a 3rd rounder for John Marino, who was excellent for them this past season. And then they're competitive, of course, in 2022. They brought in Andrew Brunette to help Lindy Ruff as an assistant. I think that can't be understated. And of course, the big move for them is taking those assets, Shakir Muhammadulin, Nikita Ohotiuk, and Fabian Zetterlund, packaged together and sent to San Jose for Timo Meier. And the way that they've been able to manage their salary cap is exceptional. They've been very methodical in this, not overspending on players. And so I want to point out this comment here from Axis. Honest to God, the best rebuild of this era might be the Devils. I know they're still on the rise and have a lot to prove, but between the contracts, the talent, and the depth, both on the roster and in their prospect pool, that team is about to go so effing hard. Other contenders include Colorado and LA. Yeah, we saw the Devils surge from irrelevance to maybe a Stanley Cup contender. And again, they should only be better given that they have youth at all major positions out there. Well, Twisters, what do you think is the best rebuild in the salary cap era? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you want me to produce a follow-up to this video on teams just coming out of their rebuilds. Stick around because I'll have more content throughout the offseason. We'll talk about some breakout players and some other projections and that sort of thing. And feel free to shout out other ideas you have for videos for this channel. I appreciate you, Twisters, so much for tuning in. I'm Nick, and I'll catch you later. Ciao for now.